In my first year as an analyst, I went on winter vacation with my parents and family, and the whole time I was working and having to pull my laptop out all the time because we were on a live deal and we were just about to close and the team needed my help on some analysis. If the client calls them on a Friday and asks them to get something done by Monday, they are going to have to agree to that. Like, they can push back, but they more often than not will have to bend over backwards to get that done. We didn't have the internal resources to even print and bind our own books. And so as an analyst, I have memories of going into the printing room, having to figure out how to print the books myself, punch holes in them, and then bind them for the meeting. Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Now, it's been a little bit over a year since I joined BCG as a management consultant, and I figured that now that I've spent the same amount of time in both investment banking at my previous job and now in management consulting, it would be a good time to make a video talking about some of the key similarities and differences that I've observed working in both of these jobs. Now, there's a ton of content out there already comparing these two fields, but I'm going to try to give you a little bit more of a personal perspective based on my own experiences with a little more detail from firsthand experience that you might not be able to find online. For those of you who are new, my name is Matt Huang, and I'm a current associate at BCG, which is a management consulting firm. And prior to BCG, I spent a little bit over a year working in investment banking. And I make these videos because I like to, but also because I would have wished that somebody would have made these for me when I was younger. So I'm going to break this video down into 3 sections. The first is going to be talking about the actual work, including the day-to-day. And the second is going to be talking about the lifestyle. And the third is going to be talking about the people. And what I can tell you right off the bat is that there are many similarities between investment banking and consulting along all 3 of those dimensions, but just as many differences. Let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is the work. And what I can tell you is that both of these fields have a lot of similarities because they're both in client advisory. And so what this means is that you're always going to have less control over your time than you would like because you're at the whims of a client. So even your managing director in investment banking or in consulting, if the client calls them on a Friday and asks them to get something done by Monday, they are going to have to agree to that. Like, they can push back, but they more often than not will have to bend over backwards to get that done, especially if it's an important meeting. And so inherently, both of these jobs are going to be very similar from that aspect. And a lot of the job for a junior consultant or junior investment banking analyst is going to be focused on preparing materials for client-related meetings, whether it's the pitch or the proposal for the very beginning of a case or a project, all the way up until the materials needed to close the deal or for the final readout if you're in consulting. But when it comes to the actual day-to-day, as an investment banking analyst, you're going to be spending much more of your time in Excel rather than in PowerPoint. And you're probably like, well, no, like, I already knew that. Everyone knows that investment banking analysts spend more time in Excel. But for consultants, this is where it can be a little bit more variable because yes, on average, you probably are spending more time in PowerPoint. But with consulting, it varies dramatically depending on what type of project you're on and what role within the project team you're on. Let me give you an example. Even if you're working on a highly quantitative and analytical project like a private equity due diligence in consulting, if you are the person staffed on the competitive landscape module, then that means you'll most likely be doing a ton of expert calls, which isn't going to require you to be in Excel at all unless you're using it to just track your calls. Whereas on the other hand, somebody on the exact same project, but who's taking the market model, will be spending a ton of their time in Excel because they're literally building a market sizing model. And so as you can see in consulting, most consultants are going to be spending more time in PowerPoint, but it will depend also on what role within what project you're currently on. And so all of this is to say, the general theme here is that in investment banking, your work is highly, highly focused on activities supporting the M&A transaction process, whereas in consulting, you will work on a extremely diverse array of projects as well as roles within that project. And so you could be working on anything from like a 2-week diligence to like a 6-month implementation project, and even the clients will be different because in investment banking, you're primarily advising corporations, whereas in consulting, you'll advise both corporations as well as government entities. And so you might even be advising the city of New York, for example, on how to improve their rat problem in the subways. The other thing that I think is not really talked about as much is that in investment banking, you're very focused on having a high degree of accuracy. You cannot mess up the numbers down to like the decimal point when you're doing a multi-million-dollar transaction because that could throw things off by a ton. Whereas in consulting, a lot of the times you're dealing with extremely vague and ambiguous questions that you may not necessarily be even able to get to an exact answer for. So there's much more of an emphasis on getting to like an 80-20 answer, which basically means like we just need to get the answer good enough to make an accurate assessment of this situation. And that's not to say that there isn't a high degree of precision in consulting. There definitely is, and a lot of thought goes into any sort of analysis that's conducted. But if you compare this to investment banking, where the financial statements have to tie, the balance sheet has to balance in the model, and like missing one decimal point can like get you in big trouble, you can see why there's just like such a high degree of emphasis on accuracy in investment banking. The other thing that I would also note is an interesting difference is that consulting firms have a ton of internal resources available to them. And something that I personally found very different when I switched over from my firm was I was at a very small investment bank, and we didn't have the internal resources to even print and bind our own books. And so as an analyst, I have memories of going into the printing room, having to figure out how to print the books myself, punch holes in them, and then bind them for the meeting. Whereas at BCG, there's not only resources internally to help with admin tasks, but also one of the big advantages of consulting firms is we have giant internal teams of just subject matter experts called the knowledge teams, who basically are people who know a ton about a specific industry and a specific area within an industry. And so anytime you need to get up to speed really quickly on like a very niche industry, like for example, the potato farming industry in Idaho, then you can go to a knowledge expert and they can get you up to speed super quickly. And that I've found to be a huge advantage in consulting. The last thing I'll note about the work in investment banking versus consulting is that in investment banking, a lot of the times you're working with the CFO directly on the deal. And in consulting, you're interfacing a lot more with like the head of strategy or the CEO. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about now is the lifestyle. And right off the bat, I'll tell you that both of these jobs are not easy. Like having worked both in investment banking and in consulting, I can tell you that there are certain advantages in consulting, but it is still a very, very intense job. And so key difference number one is obviously bankers are going to be working on average more hours because they're going to be on the clock, usually on the weekends. But again, this is only time that you're technically on the clock, not necessarily like doing intense work. And what I've actually found is that in consulting, especially when you're on a super intense project, like, a 2 or 3 week diligence, the work can get very, very intense. And like, there have been times when I've been working on a super intense project and I felt like I was working harder than I did when I was in investment banking. And you might be asking why. And the reason is that in banking, you have a lot of dead time usually after you send the deck out to your managing director. There's like a couple hours where they're reviewing it and you're kind of just like sitting around waiting for comments. Whereas in consulting, there's far less instances of this because even when you finish sending out a deck, there's always something that can be done to move the team closer to finishing the project. Another really important distinction is that consultants very rarely work on weekends. Like I personally have not worked a single weekend over my year here. But the other big thing is that because the work in consulting is project-based, it's much more predictable and you're much more able to plan vacations. So for example, I was able to take like a 2-week vacation to Japan this year because I knew that I had a project that was ending exactly in a month. And so I planned my vacation time around that so that it wouldn't conflict with my project. Compare this to in investment banking. And one of the hardest things about investment banking is taking time off when you are on a live deal, because the deal isn't going to stop for you just because you go on vacation. And so a very common occurrence of what would happen was someone would go on vacation, and if they were like the only analyst or the only associate on the deal, they would still have to pay attention to emails, hop on a call occasionally to help the junior team out, and just they couldn't really be truly logged off and offline on their vacation. And this happened to me personally in my first year as an analyst. I went on winter vacation with my parents and family, and the whole time I was working and having to pull my laptop out all the time because we were on a live deal and we were just about to close and the team needed my help on some analysis. The last thing that I want to talk about with the lifestyle, which people often ask about, is the travel. And I personally have not traveled that much in this past year because the projects that I have worked on have been with New York-based clients. That said, I've spoken with colleagues who have traveled a ton and have spent over 100 nights out of the year in hotels around the US. And what I can tell you is that the travel in consulting can get extremely draining. Whereas in banking, as an analyst, you're very rarely going to be traveling. Now, this obviously changes as you become more senior because senior bankers do travel a lot as well. But for people who are considering entering at the junior level, I think that is an important distinction to note because it will greatly impact your life. I do also want to note that although I didn't travel on a plane too much this year, I did travel to a lot of companies' headquarters in New York. And while that might sound like a cool thing, the reality of it is not so cool, because what actually ends up happening when you go to a client site is usually the junior team gets lumped into a sometimes windowless conference room for the day, and that's where you have to do your work. And the client's office is very rarely as nice as your home office with your standing desk and your Herman Miller chair and all your in-office perks. And so it's just not as cool of an experience as you might think. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about today is the people. And the number one distinction I've found between banking and consulting is that consulting is far more diverse than investment banking. And the number one driving factor behind this is that the types of people that go into investment banking tend to have much more similar backgrounds than the types of people that are accepted into consulting firms. It's a little bit of both a self-selection thing as well as a skill set thing, because in order to get into investment banking, you often have to have a little bit more technical knowledge about finance and accounting than you would need to get into consulting. And so the majority of people getting into investment banking out of college will have studied some form of undergrad business, whether that's finance or accounting, something of that sort. And yes, there's going to be like one or two people who studied at a liberal arts college, but I think it's safe to say that the majority of folks going into banking will have studied some combination of like economics, accounting, or finance. Whereas in consulting firms are way more open to taking people from different backgrounds. So you'll have someone like a PhD student in microbiology who gets into a consulting firm because as long as you can do the case, you can get the job. Now, that's not to say that consulting is not competitive, because in some ways, the consulting case interviews are arguably more difficult to prepare for than just memorizing investment banking technicals. But I think it's a very important distinction to note that there are much more diverse groups of people going into management consulting. And as a result of that, the cultures between investment banks and consulting firms are going to be very different. I personally have found this difference to be a positive thing, because I've found that the people in management consulting have been very reasonable about expectations, and also just whenever I need to step out. I used to feel really guilty when I was in investment banking when I had to step out of town just to go downtown for a couple hours for a dentist appointment, which sounds crazy, but that just kind of speaks to the culture in finance, where you're kind of expected to just be on the clock constantly. Whereas in consulting, people are a lot more reasonable, and they understand that you have obligations outside of work. If you're currently considering either of these fields, what I will say is that you can't go wrong with either. Most people that I've spoken with have not regretted it, because they've learned a lot and they've grown both like personally and professionally. But what I would say is try to think very deeply about what you actually want to do in the future, and then decide which of these paths will lead you there the quickest. If you know for a fact that you want to work in high finance for your long-term career, then investment banking is probably the path of least resistance for you. Whereas if you're not sure if you want to go into finance, but you still want to get very transferable skills and work on interesting projects with really smart people, then I think you can't go wrong with consulting either. But anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video. And as always, hit the like and subscribe button and leave a comment below if you have any suggestions for future content. Thanks.